We have here two of the finest examples of firearms engraving in existence. They are two exquisite 28 gauge side-by-side shotguns, and they are in two very different styles of engraving. We're in the Peterson Gallery of the National Firearms Museum, a brand new gallery with firearms from the collection of the late Robert E. Peterson, the finest firearms in the world in terms of quality, decoration, and fit. And we're going to take a look at these, and with the help of Wendy Cunningham from our museum staff, we're going to talk a little bit about the artistry involved in the engraving. And also, these have a common theme in that they borrow their engraving theme from mythology, which is somewhat unusual in engraving. And I'm going to start with this beautiful Holland and Holland. Now, there's a grand British tradition of best guns. And what that means is there's a very select handful of British makers who created the finest side-by-side and double guns ever made. And they would offer them in various qualities, from a common field grade on up to the best grade. So the British best gun is a fine tradition that goes back well over a century and a half. And this is from one of the best known of the fine British makers, Holland and Holland. This particular gun was created in about 1983, and it was engraved by the very famous Brown brothers. One thing we want to compare on these two guns is the style of engraving. And this is the traditional style of engraving that has been around for centuries. There's a wonderful three-dimensional effect on a fairly flat surface, but this is obtained in this case by actual relief engraving. The carving actually has rounded edges and sculpted dimensions to where there's just a little bit of three-dimensional depth to create these very rounded and full figures and images on a fairly flat field. And we'll compare this to Bulino engraving, which we see on the next gun, which is essentially a totally flat field, but still it obtains the illusion of three dimensions. But this one is beautifully done by one of the finest firearms engravers ever to live. And it borrows from mythology for a theme. Wendy, you've researched this a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about the thematic elements on this gun?
Absolutely. First of all, I'd like to say it's a basic neoclassical style, borrowing, like you said, on the ancient Greek, ancient Roman stories. In a simple word, it could just be typical classical figures draped in a typical classical fashion. However, at a closer look, it seems that this artist is borrowing from individual stories. Those stories could be those of Aphrodite, Adonis, and Persephone. I came to this conclusion based on how the figures are clothed. Venus, Aphrodite, usually bearing her chest, which is what this figure is doing here. On the reverse side, if you turn it over, you again see two women, one fully clothed here, this one again bearing the chest with a small child. The story of Adonis, Persephone, and Aphrodite was that of love. Persephone was told to care for the infant Adonis, and for Aphrodite, when she would not give him up, there was a feuding, and Zeus decided to have him spend half his time with each. Long story short, he ended up passing away due to a boar, and his blood was then turned into the anemone, which was a bright red flower similar to a poppy, which also occurs in the decoration.
Okay.
So it's a school of thought. It could be nothing.
Yeah,
but
and you've got other decorative elements there. The grape images are repeated. She's apparently making some type of sacrifice here. When you and our senior curator, Doug Wickland, put your heads together on it, there was another myth that Doug had considered on this one. Do you remember what that was? I've forgotten exactly which one it was.
And I unfortunately did not grab that paperwork, but it had to do with this figure here playing the lyre.
But an exquisite gun, truly a masterpiece of firearms engraving. And although these are both 28 gauge double barrels and both have mythological scenes and both are wonderfully engraved, the engraving style couldn't be more different than this Rizzini shotgun here. Beautiful Bulino style engraving. Now, as opposed to the relief engraving, the Bulino style is done by using dots and lines to create the illusion of three dimensions.
And only one's pressure of the hand,
okay,
which
so
is amazing.
Both of these are basically hand-cut engravings. And steel's not a very forgiving material. It's you slip and you can't really erase.
Yes, there's no erasing.
But
what I really love about the Bulino and the fact that it is merely a pick with different shaped ends is that you are actually able to create the photorealism of dimensions and depths of light that your human eye can't even distinguish. And a schooled artist can get, I believe, up to 15 different variations of light. Most can only get up to 8, and beyond 8, the human eye can't even recognize it. But I mean, the wonderful linear aspect, all created with dots and in some cases lines, is amazing. And go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, we have these odd, terrible-looking masks or heads on these
creatures.
What can you tell us about the images that are depicted on this?
Well, in the research I did, the basic name would be a manticore. It's a chimera or a gargoyle made up of different creatures. In this case, you have a human face, a head of a lion, and wings of an eagle and rest of the body of a serpent. And this artist has done a phenomenal job of working that curvature of the serpent's tail into the rest of the design.
Now, continuing on with the amount of detail that is involved in this type of engraving. This particular gun is rather well known and it's illustrated in a book here. And I wanted to try and give a sense of the detail of work that is involved in this. Now, we're not going to look at the main face right here. We're going to look at a detail of just this little part of the gun right here. Let me grab this and bring it up here. And I don't know if this is another manticore type being or not. It's the head of an eagle with the body of a snake and a woman's torso on it here. But this actually appears right here on the gun. And you can see the very fine dot work that goes into sculpting those feathers. Something you never think about when looking at the engraving, but when you see it enlarged to this scale, you see the line work that goes into shading the background and the shadow that he's added to it. And to cut those straight lines, those are totally freehand cuts on a very tiny scale that to keep those parallel and even and to create the illusion of shade with those is just a remarkable achievement. And then when you look at the shadowing on these scrolls and realize that's not done by making a rounded scroll, that's made by shading a flat piece of steel, you become aware of the masterwork that's involved in this gun. The engraver on this is one of the finest engravers ever living, still working today. Fracassi, an Italian engraver, and we have just two masterpieces, one Italian with a famous Italian engraver, the other British with a famous British engraver, both tapping into the vein of mythology.
Absolutely.
Two real treasures in the Robert E. Peterson Gallery at the National Firearms Museum. We're open every day of the week, 9:30 to 5 p.m. And if you can't get by to the museum to see these, check them out at nramuseum.com. Be sure to go into the viewer on these because you can pull up a very, very detailed close-up and really get down into those individual cuts and appreciate the artistry that goes into this type of firearms engraving.